Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into a time when the pantry wasn't just a little bare. It was often a cavern of echoes, a testament to a nation's hunger. We're exploring why food sucked and was so incredibly scarce during the Great Depression. Imagine, for a moment, your own kitchen. The gentle hum of the refrigerator, a beacon of cold, preserved abundance. You open it, and light spills out over shelves packed with, well, probably too many things you've forgotten about if you're anything like me. Now picture that same door swinging open to reveal nothing. Maybe a single, hopeful onion, or a half-empty jar of something you're not quite sure about. That's the world we're stepping into. And let's be honest, with our modern sensibilities and reliance on next-day delivery for artisanal sourdough, you probably wouldn't survive this. I certainly wouldn't last a week without my oat milk latte. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support really does make a difference, and while you're at it, I'd love to see where you're all tuning in from tonight. Drop your city and current time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the cusp, the very edge of an era. It's the late 1920s, and for many, life feels, well, it feels like it's on an upward swing. The newspapers, when you can afford one and have the time to read it, are full of talk about progress, about new inventions, about a stock market that only ever seems to go up. It's the age of flappers and jazz, of Henry Ford's automobiles starting to crowd the streets, and a sense that the future is a bright, gleaming thing, probably chrome-plated. This period, often dubbed the Roaring Twenties, was characterized by significant industrial growth and a surge in consumerism, at least for a visible segment of the population. You see it in the advertisements, the glossy portrayals of families with newfangled iceboxes, stocked with all sorts of wonders. Imagine the Sunday dinner table in a reasonably comfortable household. Perhaps there's a roasted chicken glistening and fragrant, potatoes mashed with a generous dollop of butter, maybe a bright green vegetable if you're lucky, and a pie cooling on the windowsill, its scent mingling with the smell of polish from the freshly cleaned dining table. The pantry, if you were to peek inside, isn't overflowing like a prepper's bunker, but it's comfortably stocked. Tins of peaches, sacks of flour and sugar, perhaps some home-canned goods from the summer's bounty. There's a rhythm to it, a comforting predictability. You work, you earn, you buy food, you eat. It's a simple equation that feels as solid as the foundations of your own home. Of course, even in these supposedly golden times, not everyone was living this dream. Rural communities, especially farmers, were already feeling a pinch long before the cities did. Prices for their crops had been less than stellar for years, but the overall vibe, the general narrative being spun, was one of prosperity, of an ever-expanding pie with enough slices for everyone. Eventually, you might hear your parents or grandparents talking about the good old days before the Great War, but these days? These felt like the new good days. There was an optimism, a kind of jaunty confidence that permeated the air, as thick and sweet as the cheap perfume worn by the young women kicking up their heels to the Charleston. Perhaps a bit too much confidence, like someone wearing a brand new suit that's just a little too tight across the shoulders. Looks good, but one wrong move and the seams might just give. A quirky little culinary trend gaining traction around this time, a sign of modernity and perhaps a touch of whimsy, was the Jell-O salad. Not just sweet fruity Jell-O, mind you, but elaborate moulded creations often involving, well, questionable additions. Think lime Jell-O with shredded cabbage and pineapple, or even more daring concoctions involving tuna, olives or marshmallows, all suspended in that jiggly translucent medium. It was seen as sophisticated, a testament to the wonders of modern food processing. Little did anyone know that soon, the thought of any food, let alone such peculiar novelties, would become a consuming obsession for entirely different reasons. Then, the whispers start. Soft at first, like dry leaves skittering across a distant pavement. Talk of market corrections, of temporary downturns. You hear it from the man selling newspapers on the corner, his usual cheerful patter now tinged with a note of something you can't quite place. Worry, perhaps. The headlines are a bit starker. Words like panic and crash begin to appear, initially in the financial pages, which you might usually skip, but now they seem to bleed onto the front page, impossible to ignore. You're at the local grocer's, perhaps, deciding between two brands of coffee. when you notice the prices. Just a penny or two higher on some items maybe. Or perhaps the butcher, usually so jovial, seems a bit more reserved. He's not pushing the more expensive cuts today. He's just weighing your modest purchase of stewing beef with a quiet efficiency that feels different. The air, once buzzing with that jaunty optimism, now holds a static charge of uncertainty. Historians still argue whether the agricultural sector's struggles throughout the 1920s were a clear warning sign ignored by the titans of industry and finance, or simply a contained issue an otherwise booming economy was expected to absorb. Were the cracks already there, hidden beneath a veneer of glittering prosperity, or did the structure just suddenly, catastrophically, fail? It's a complex question, but for the average person, you, standing in your kitchen staring at a slightly less full pantry than last month, the academic debate means little. What means something is the dawning, chilling realization that the simple equation work, earn, buy, eat is becoming a lot more complicated. The shift isn't like a sudden blackout, it's more like a dimmer switch being slowly, almost imperceptibly turned down. One week you decide to forgo the Sunday roast for something a bit cheaper. The next, the children get slightly smaller portions of dessert. These are small adjustments, the kind families make all the time when budgets get tight. You tell yourself it's temporary. Everyone says it's temporary. The men in charge, the ones with the important sounding titles and the big serious desks, they'll sort it out. They always do, don't they? But the dimmer switch keeps turning, and the light of that golden age, which seems so bright and unbreakable, is beginning to flicker, casting long, unsettling shadows into the corners of everyday life, especially into the heart of the home, the kitchen. The laughter around the dinner table becomes a little more subdued. The conversation's a little more focused on making ends meet, on stretching what you have. That feeling of an ever-expanding pie? It's shrinking, and you're starting to wonder if there will be a slice for you tomorrow. That dimmer switch we talked about, the one slowly darkening the promise of prosperity. Well, in a vast swathe of the American heartland, it's about to be joined by a far more literal and terrifying darkness. You're not just worried about the numbers in a ledger book or the dwindling coins in your purse anymore. You're looking up at the sky, and the sky itself seems to be falling. The golden age isn't just ending with a whimper of economic decline. For millions, it's about to be choked by an unimaginable tide of earth. Imagine you're on a farm, perhaps in Oklahoma, Kansas, or the Texas Panhandle. For years, the land has been good to your family, or at least it's provided. But the rains, they've become shy, then downright elusive. The sun, once a life-giving friend, now beats down with a relentless baking fury. The soil, once rich and dark, has turned pale and powdery under your worn boots. You've heard stories from the old-timers about droughts, about hard times, but this feels different. The horizon, usually so clear you could see for miles, starts to look hazy, then a strange ominous brown. A stillness falls, the kind that makes the birds stop singing and the livestock restless. And then it comes. Not a rain cloud, but a wall. A monstrous roiling wall of blackness stretching from the earth to what feels like the heavens, consuming everything in its path. These are the black blizzards, the terrifying calling card of the Dust Bowl. The term itself, Dust Bowl, is said to have been coined by a reporter in 1935 after witnessing one particularly ferocious storm. But the reality it describes had been building for years. This wasn't just a bit of dust, like after a windy day. This was topsoil, millions of tons of it, ripped from the mismanaged and drought-stricken prairies, now airborne and angry. You see it rolling towards your small farmhouse, a terrifying spectacle of nature's fury. There's a low rumble, not of thunder, but of the earth itself in motion. You scramble to get inside, stuffing rags, towels, anything you can find, into the cracks around windows and doors, but it's a futile effort. The dust is finer than talcum powder. It seeps through every defence, insidious and relentless. It coats every surface, a gritty film on the plates you are about to set for a meagre dinner, a layer on the children's faces as they huddle in fear. You can taste it, a dry, earthy bitterness that clogs your throat and lines your lungs. You try to breathe through a damp cloth, but it doesn't help much. The air grows thick, and the world outside vanishes into an opaque, choking darkness, even at midday. Sometimes these storms, these dusters, would last for hours, sometimes for days, turning day into an eerie, suffocating night. It's like being buried alive, but you can still walk around. Food production? It's a cruel joke. The seeds you painstakingly planted, hoping for a small crop to feed your family or to sell for a pittance, are either blown away or buried under drifts of dust that look like dark, malevolent snow. Your vegetable garden, tended with such care, is now just another patch of barren, windswept earth. Historians still debate the precise balance between natural drought cycles, which are a recurring feature of the Great Plains, and the human agricultural practices, the ploughing up of native grasses for wheat farming, in causing the Dust Bowl's unprecedented severity. Was it an act of God, or a man-made catastrophe amplified by nature? The consensus leans towards a devastating combination of both. The livestock, if you have any left, suffer terribly. They inhale the dust, their lungs filling with grit, leading to a condition farmers grimly call dust pneumonia, which, by the way, afflicted humans too. Sometimes cattle would be found dead, their stomachs packed solid with dust and mud from grazing on the last vestiges of buried vegetation. Chickens would suffocate. You might try to keep a few animals in the barn, but the dust finds its way in there too. The water in the troughs turns to sludge. A particularly bizarre and unsettling phenomenon during these dust storms was the extreme static electricity. The air would become so charged with friction from the swirling dust particles that it could make your hair stand on end, even indoors. Blue sparks could be seen dancing along barbed wire fences or the tips of windmill blades. Touching another person or a metal object could result in a surprisingly powerful shock, strong enough to knock you off your feet if you weren't careful. Imagine trying to prepare what little food you have while navigating a minefield of tiny lightning bolts in your own kitchen. Forget trying to get good radio reception. You'd be lucky if the static didn't try to give you a new hairstyle. Your pantry, already thinned by the economic hardship filtering down from the cities, now faces this direct physical assault. Any food not sealed in airtight containers, a luxury many couldn't afford, would be contaminated. Flour, sugar, cornmeal, all would have a gritty texture. People would try to cover their food with damp cloths while eating, but it was a losing battle. There were grim jokes about eating your peck of dirt not over a lifetime but in a single meal. Housewives would knead dough, and by the time it was ready for the oven, it would have a visible layer of dust settled on it. They'd wipe it off, bake it, and hope for the best. Some people claimed they could tell where a person was from by the colour of the dust in their sputum. Charming, right? The impact wasn't just on the food you were trying to grow or store, it was on the very possibility of future food. The topsoil, the fertile layer essential for agriculture, was literally blowing away, sometimes travelling thousands of miles. Dust from Oklahoma would settle on ships hundreds of miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. This ecological devastation meant that even if the rains returned, even if the economy somehow magically fixed itself, the land itself was wounded, perhaps for generations. The most infamous single dust storm, known as Black Sunday, on April 14th, 1935, carried an estimated 300,000 tons of topsoil. It was a turning point for many the moment they realised the land was truly broken and that there was no future for them there. So, you're there, in your dust-filled house, listening to the wind howl like a banshee, the grit between your teeth, the worry a cold knot in your stomach. The food you had hoped to harvest is gone. The food you had stored is tainted. The very earth that was supposed to sustain you has become a source of torment. The lines for bread in the cities were a symbol of economic failure. This was something more elemental, a failure of the land itself, a stark, dusty testament to how quickly abundance could turn to desolation. And the question of what to eat tomorrow becomes less about affording it, and more about finding it in a world that seems determined to starve you out, one gust of wind at a time. The dust storms were an aggressive, in-your-face assault on your ability to find food, especially if you were a farmer. But even if you lived far from the Dust Bowl, in a city apartment or a suburban house, where the sky remained stubbornly blue, another quieter kind of storm was brewing, one that would just as effectively empty your pantry. The collapse of the banking system. Your money, the stuff you relied on to buy that bread, those potatoes, that small piece of meat, was about to perform a vanishing act worthy of Houdini, only far less entertaining. Imagine it's a Tuesday morning. You woke up, perhaps a little worried about the news from Wall Street, but still, you have your savings. Maybe not a fortune, but enough tucked away in the local bank to see you through a rainy day or two. It's the fruit of your labour, carefully set aside. You trust your bank. It's a solid brick building on Main Street, with tellers who know your name, maybe even ask after your kids. It's an institution, a pillar of the community. Banks don't just disappear, do they? Oh, but they do. The news starts to trickle in, then it becomes a flood. Banks are closing. Not just one or two, but hundreds, then thousands across the country. It's called a bank run. Fear, pure and simple, is the catalyst. You hear that a neighbouring bank has suspended withdrawals because it doesn't have enough cash on hand to meet everyone's demands. Suddenly your own bank, that solid pillar, looks a little less solid. The thought sparks. What if my money isn't safe? And that thought, multiplied by thousands of other anxious depositors, creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. You join the crowd. You have to. You hurry down to your bank, your heart thumping a nervous rhythm against your ribs. The line already snakes out the door and down the street. Faces are grim, anxious. Whispers ripple through the crowd. Did you hear about First National? They say people's trust won't open tomorrow. The air is thick with panic, more contagious than any flu. You stand there for hours, shuffling forward inch by agonizing inch, clutching your passbook. The sun beats down, or maybe a cold wind whips around you, but you barely notice. All your focus is on that door, on the hope that when you finally reach the teller, your money will still be there. Sometimes you'd make it. You'd withdraw your funds, feeling a wave of relief, even as you wondered where to keep it safe now. Under the mattress, buried in a coffee can in the backyard. These were common, if not entirely secure, alternatives, but often by the time you reached the front of the line, or even before, a notice would be posted on the door. Temporarily closed. Temporarily, but everyone knew what it often meant. It meant your money was gone. Poof. Vanished into the complex, opaque world of finance that had suddenly, spectacularly imploded. The stark historical fact is that between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks in the United States failed. This wasn't just a Wall Street problem. This was a Main Street catastrophe. Your savings, whether it was a few dollars or a few thousand, simply ceased to exist in any accessible form. There was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, back then to guarantee your deposits. That crucial safety net wouldn't be established until 1933. So, if your bank went under, your money went with it. Imagine the feeling. The work, the thrift, the careful planning for the future, all wiped out overnight, not by a natural disaster, but by a failure of a system you were taught to trust. This had an immediate and devastating impact on people's ability to buy food. The grocery money you had in your account for the week, gone. The small nest egg you were relying on to supplement your dwindling wages, vanished. Even if food was available in the stores, and its availability was becoming increasingly precarious for other reasons we'll explore, you now had no means to purchase it. Your purchasing power evaporated. You might have a job for now, but your past savings, the buffer against hard times, had been snatched away. A quirky and rather desperate practice that emerged in some communities was the use of local scrip or makeshift currencies. When official money became incredibly scarce due to bank failures and hoarding, some towns or even local businesses would issue their own temporary paper money, often made of wood, leather, or even cardboard. Clamshells were famously used as currency in Pismo Beach, California, for a short time. This emergency money was usually only good for local transactions, a sort of IOU system born of necessity. It highlights the complete breakdown of the normal financial system, forcing people to get very creative just to facilitate basic trade, like buying a loaf of bread or a quart of milk. You might have been paid in wooden nickels, and not in the metaphorical sense. Historians still argue whether the Federal Reserve's monetary policies in the early years of the Depression significantly exacerbated the banking crisis. Some contend that by contracting the money supply when it should have been expanding it to help struggling banks, the Fed inadvertently deepened and prolonged the agony. Others argue that the structural weaknesses within the banking system itself, with its thousands of small, undercapitalized banks, made a wave of failures almost inevitable once the economic downturn began in earnest. Did the pilots of the financial system steer us into the storm, or did the ship simply fall apart due to poor construction? The debate continues, but for you, standing outside the closed bank, it's all academic. Your stomach is rumbling and your wallet is empty. The psychological impact of seeing your money disappear was profound. It wasn't just the loss of purchasing power, it was a loss of security, of trust, of a sense of order in the world. If the banks couldn't be trusted, what could? This erosion of faith had far-reaching consequences, making people even more fearful, more inclined to hoard what little they had, further constricting the flow of money and credit that economies rely on. So, you trudge home from the closed bank, your passbook now a useless booklet. The pantry, which might have seemed reasonably stocked yesterday, now looks terrifyingly finite. Each can, each bag of flour, represents a meal that cannot be easily replaced. The link between money and food is elemental, and when the money vanishes, the spectre of hunger, once a distant thought for many, now sits right down at your kitchen table, an unwelcome and persistent guest. The dust storms were stealing the future of food from the land. The bank failures were stealing the present, snatching the food right out of your hand before you could even get it to your mouth. The struggle to eat wasn't just about finding a job or growing a crop. It was now also about a fundamental breakdown in the very means of exchange. The money in your bank account might have pulled a disappearing act worthy of a Vegas magic show, but another equally critical pillar of your ability to put food on the table was also crumbling. Your job. Or if you were still lucky enough to have one, your wages. The connection is painfully simple. No job or a drastically reduced paycheck means no money. And as we've just seen, no money means a direct, unavoidable impact on what and if you eat. The Roaring Twenties might have hummed with the sound of industry, but the 1930s echoed with a deafening silence from closed factories and empty workshops. Imagine you're a factory worker, perhaps in a steel mill in Pittsburgh, an auto plant in Detroit, or a textile mill in North Carolina. For years your work has been hard, often grueling, but it's been steady. The shift whistle was a daily call, the clang and roar of machinery the soundtrack to your life. It meant a paycheck, modest perhaps, but regular, enough to cover the rent, put shoes on the children's feet, and crucially, buy groceries. Then the slowdown begins. First, it's rumours of cutbacks. Then, your shift hours are reduced. Temporary measure, the foreman says, his face looking as worried as yours. But temporary starts to feel awfully permanent. Soon, the dreaded pink slips start appearing. Men who have worked at the same company for decades, men who thought their jobs were as secure as the rising sun, are suddenly told their services are no longer required. The factory gates, once a symbol of opportunity, now become a place of despair as crowds of laid-off workers gather, hoping for any news, any scrap of work. You might be one of them, standing in a line that's not for bread, not yet, but for the dwindling hope of employment. The official unemployment rate in the United States skyrocketed, reaching a staggering peak of nearly 25% in 1933. 1 in 4 officially recognised workers was without a job. Think about that. In any group of 4 people you knew who were in the workforce, one of them was likely unemployed. And this official statistic didn't even fully capture the extent of underemployment. People working drastically reduced hours or taking any menial task they could find for pennies. Even if you managed to cling to your job, your wages were likely slashed. Businesses, desperate to stay afloat in the face of collapsing demand, cut pay relentlessly. A 10% cut, then 20%, sometimes even more. You're working just as hard, maybe even harder, under the constant fear of being next on the chopping block, but you're bringing home significantly less. The arithmetic of your household budget becomes a brutal daily puzzle. How do you stretch 70 cents to do the work of $1? How do you choose between paying the rent and buying enough food? These were not abstract economic theories. These were agonizing daily decisions for millions. The impact on food purchasing was immediate and stark. The Sunday roast, which, as we remember from section 1, was already becoming a memory for some, is now an impossible dream. Meat of any kind becomes a rare luxury. You switch to cheaper cuts, then to even cheaper ones. Organ meats, if you can find and afford them, or meatless meals become the norm. Fresh fruits and vegetables, once a regular part of a healthy diet, are now indulgences. You rely on filling, cheap staples, potatoes, beans, bread, if you can get it. Milk for the children might be diluted with water to make it last longer. Every penny is scrutinised, every purchase weighed against the gnawing fear of an empty cupboard. A quirky and rather sad indicator of the times was the Hoover apple or Depression apple. This wasn't a new variety of fruit, it was slang for a raw potato. Potatoes were cheap, filling, and relatively available. So if you were hungry and had nothing else, you might just eat a raw potato like you would an apple. It's a small, almost comical detail, but it speaks volumes about the desperation and the drastic downgrading of what was considered an acceptable meal. Forget your 5 a day, you were lucky to get your 1 a day, and it might just be a spud. You'd also see people reusing tea bags multiple times, or boiling coffee grounds over and over until the resulting brew was little more than faintly coloured hot water. Waste not, want not, taken to an extreme. Historians still argue about the primary drivers of this catastrophic unemployment. Was it the collapse in consumer demand, as people, fearful and impoverished, stopped buying goods? Or was it the inflexible wage rates that, according to some classical economic theories, prevented the labour market from adjusting more quickly to the downturn? Perhaps it was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which raised import duties to record levels, leading to retaliatory tariffs from other countries and a collapse in international trade, thereby crippling export industries. The truth, as is often the case, is likely a complex interplay of all these factors and more. But for you, the person whose stomach is growling, the why is less important than the what now. The search for work became a defining experience of the era. Men, and sometimes women, would ride the rails, illegally hopping freight trains to travel from city to city, chasing rumours of jobs that often turned out to be non-existent. They became part of a drifting, disenfranchised army of the unemployed, often living in squalid makeshift camps known as Hoovervilles, which we'll explore more later. The simple act of looking for work was exhausting, demoralising, and often fruitless. You'd walk miles, stand in lines for hours, only to be told, nothing today. And each rejection was another blow to your dignity, another tightening of the hunger pangs. For those who had always taken pride in providing for their families, the inability to do so was a source of profound shame and despair. The traditional gender roles, where the man was the breadwinner, were thrown into disarray. Sometimes, women or older children could find sporadic, low-paying work when men could not, which could create new tensions within the family structure. The constant worry about where the next meal would come from permeated every aspect of life. It strained relationships, frayed nerves, and cast a long shadow over childhoods. So you're in this situation. The bank might have taken your savings, and now your job, or a significant chunk of your income, has also vanished. The chain from earning a living to eating a meal is broken at one of its most fundamental links. The grocery store shelves might not be entirely empty yet, but your ability to access what's on them is severely crippled. That steady, reliable paycheck, the one you perhaps took for granted in the good times, is now a distant memory, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty and the very real, very physical sensation of hunger. The landscape of your daily life has been redrawn, and the path to the dinner table has become a treacherous uphill climb. Your savings are gone, your job has vanished, or your wages have been decimated, and if you were a farmer, the very earth might be blowing away. The question of where your next meal is coming from looms larger and more terrifying with each passing day. In such a crisis, you'd naturally look to the government, the highest authority in the land, for help, for some kind of plan, some reassurance that someone somewhere knew how to fix this monumental mess. But in the early years of the Great Depression, the response from Washington, particularly from President Herbert Hoover's administration, often felt like a distant, hesitant echo rather than a decisive call to action. Imagine you're listening to the radio, if you still have one and can afford the electricity. You're straining to hear words of comfort, of concrete solutions from the nation's leader. Instead, what you often hear are pronouncements about the fundamental soundness of the economy, assurances that prosperity is just around the corner, and a strong emphasis on rugged individualism and local responsibility. President Hoover, a man who had earned a global reputation as a brilliant humanitarian for his efforts, organising food relief in Europe after World War I, found himself philosophically opposed to large-scale direct federal aid to the unemployed. He believed that such aid would undermine the American character, create dependency, and damage the spirit of self-reliance. A mainstream historical fact is that Hoover's administration did initiate some public works projects, like the Hoover Dam, then called Boulder Dam, and established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, in 1932 to provide loans to banks, railroads, and large businesses, hoping the benefits would trickle down to the average citizen. But for you, Standing in a breadline or watching your children grow thinner, trickle down felt like a cruel joke when the tap seemed to be completely dry. The idea of rugged individualism sounded hollow when you were doing everything humanly possible to find work, to feed your family, and still failing. You weren't looking for a handout necessarily, you were looking for a lifeline. You were looking for recognition that the crisis was too vast, too overwhelming for individuals, local charities, or even state governments to handle alone. The prevailing economic orthodoxy of the time, for many in power, was that depressions were a natural part of the business cycle. They would eventually correct themselves. The government's role was primarily to balance the budget and maintain a sound currency, not to engage in massive social welfare programs. This wasn't necessarily born of malice, but of a deeply ingrained set of beliefs about the proper role and limits of government. Unfortunately, this was not a typical downturn. It was an economic cataclysm unlike anything the nation had ever experienced. And the old rulebook didn't seem to apply. One of the more controversial actions, or perhaps inactions that historians still argue about, is Hoover's reluctance to embrace federal unemployment relief. While he did eventually approve some federal loans to states for relief purposes, these were often viewed as too little, too late, and tangled in red tape. Critics argued that his ideological commitment to limited government prevented him from taking the swift, decisive, and large-scale action that the crisis demanded. Defenders might say he was acting prudently, trying to avoid setting dangerous precedents of federal overreach, and that the scale of the depression was simply unprecedented and caught everyone off guard. Whatever the reasoning, the lived reality for millions was that the federal government, in those initial desperate years, appeared either unwilling or unable to provide the direct, immediate help they needed to simply eat. A quirky and rather telling tidbit reflecting the public mood towards Hoover was the naming of the shanty towns that sprang up on the outskirts of cities. These collections of shacks built from scrap wood, packing crates, and corrugated iron were bitterly dubbed Hoovervilles. Old broken-down cars used for shelter were Hoover wagons, or if pulled by horses because the owner couldn't afford gas, Hoover carts. Newspapers used by homeless people to keep warm were Hoover blankets. Pockets turned inside out to show they were empty were Hoover flags. It was a stark, sarcastic form of public commentary, a way for ordinary people to express their frustration and assign blame, rightly or wrongly, for their suffering. These weren't terms of endearment, they were indictments. So you're trying to navigate this landscape of hunger. You might turn to local charities, churches, or community groups. These organisations, staffed by dedicated and often overwhelmed volunteers, did their best. They set up soup kitchens and distributed what meagre aid they could muster. But the sheer scale of the need dwarfed their resources. Imagine a small lifeboat trying to rescue the passengers of a sinking ocean liner. That was the situation for private charity in the early 1930s. They were simply swamped. The official government line often seemed to downplay the severity of the hunger. There were statements suggesting that no one was actually starving, or that reports of widespread destitution were exaggerated. This, understandably, bred resentment and a feeling of abandonment among those who were quite literally going hungry. You might read a government report full of optimistic statistics, while your own children were asking why there was no food for dinner. The disconnect was jarring and painful. It wasn't that Hoover was a callous man. His earlier humanitarian work clearly showed a capacity for compassion. But his philosophical framework, his belief in American individualism and localism, struggled to adapt to a crisis that shattered all previous notions of scale and scope. He was, in many ways, a man caught between his principles and an unfolding catastrophe that demanded a different kind of response. His attempts to rally business leaders to maintain wages and employment, based on voluntary cooperation, largely failed as the economic vortex pulled everyone down. This hesitation, this perceived inadequacy of the federal response in the early years, directly translated into more empty stomachs and more desperate families. While economic forces are complex, and no single person or policy can be blamed for the entirety of the Great Depression, the delay in robust federal intervention meant that the suffering was prolonged and deepened. The safety net, which today we largely take for granted, things like unemployment insurance, food stamps, social security, was either non-existent or in its most nascent, inadequate stages. You were, in a very real sense, on your own, or reliant on the strained capacity of your local community. And as the crisis wore on, that capacity was stretched to the breaking point, and beyond. The hope that prosperity was just around the corner began to sound less like reassurance and more like a cruel delusion, especially when your most pressing concern was finding enough food to make it through the day. The government's initial hesitation and the inadequacy of local relief efforts meant that for countless people, the grim reality of hunger became an unavoidable daily companion. And one of the most potent, enduring symbols of this widespread desperation, an image seared into the collective memory of the Great Depression, was the breadline. It wasn't just a line, it was a public declaration of need, a stark visual testament to the fact that the richest country on earth was failing to feed its own people. Imagine the scene. It's a chilly morning in a big city, maybe New York, Chicago or Philadelphia. The wind whips scraps of paper down the grimy street, and there, stretching for blocks, sometimes around corners and out of sight, is a line of people. Men mostly in threadbare coats, their faces etched with a mixture of weariness, shame, and a kind of stoic resignation. Some wear hats, pulled down low, as if to hide from the gaze of passers-by, though many of those passers-by are likely in similar straits. Women are there too, sometimes with children clutching their skirts, their eyes wide and questioning. You stand among them, your stomach hollow, the cold seeping into your bones. The wait can be hours long, often for a single loaf of bread, perhaps a cup of thin soup or a meagre handout of potatoes. These lines formed outside bakeries that might be giving away day-old bread, or more commonly, outside missions, churches, or emergency relief stations set up by charities or municipal authorities. The bread itself was often nothing special. Plain, sometimes stale, but it was something. It was sustenance. It was the difference between an empty belly and a partially filled one. The act of waiting, of standing for hours in all kinds of weather, often with no guarantee that the food wouldn't run out before you reached the front, was a profoundly demoralizing experience. Think about the social aspect. These were people who, just a few years or even months earlier, had been employed, self-sufficient, proud. Now they were reduced to waiting in line for a handout. There was a deep sense of shame for many, a feeling of having failed, even though the circumstances were largely beyond their individual control. The breadline was a great leveller. It brought together people from different walks of life, former white-collar workers standing shoulder to shoulder with labourers, all united by the common denominator of hunger. Yet, despite the shared hardship, there was often a quiet dignity, a sense of order. People waited their turn, patiently, grimly. There were rarely riots or disturbances in these lines. The energy was more one of exhaustion and quiet desperation. A well-known historical fact is that the notorious gangster Al Capone, of all people, opened one of the first soup kitchens in Chicago in 1930. Capone's kitchen served 3 free meals a day to the unemployed, while his motives were undoubtedly complex, part public relations, part genuine charity, part perhaps a way to maintain social order in his sphere of influence. It highlighted the stark reality that private citizens, even those operating outside the law, were stepping in to fill a void left by overwhelmed official channels. It's a strange irony. A man responsible for so much violence and crime, also ladling out soup to the hungry. His kitchen reportedly served thousands of meals daily. The bread itself, the prize at the end of this long, weary wait, was often the focus of intense anxiety. Would it be enough? Would it be fresh? Could you get an extra piece for your children? Stories abound of men breaking down in tears when they were told the bread had run out just as they reached the front of the line, or the quiet triumph of securing that loaf, wrapping it carefully, and hurrying home with it, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing hunger. The food itself, a simple staple, became imbued with an almost sacred quality. A quirky and rather poignant detail you might observe in some breadlines was the effort people made to maintain appearances, even in dire circumstances. Men might still wear a tie, even if it was frayed and their shirt collar was dirty. Shoes would be shined if they had any polish left. It was a small act of defiance against the crushing poverty, an attempt to hold on to a shred of their former dignity, a reminder that they were more than just the unemployed or the hungry. It speaks to the human need for self-respect, even when facing abject deprivation. Historians still argue about the true extent of starvation during the Great Depression. While documented cases of death directly attributed to starvation were relatively rare in official statistics, often The cause of death would be listed as a disease exacerbated by malnutrition like pneumonia or tuberculosis. There's little doubt that severe chronic hunger and malnutrition were widespread. The breadlines were the visible tip of an iceberg of suffering. For every person in that line, there were likely others at home too sick, too old, too young, or too ashamed to join them. Were people literally starving to death in the streets in large numbers? Probably not in the way one might imagine from famines in other parts of the world. But were people suffering from debilitating hunger, a lack of essential nutrients that made them vulnerable to disease and shortened their lives? Absolutely. The experience of the breadline also fostered a strange kind of camaraderie amongst some. Strangers, thrown together by circumstance, might share stories, offer a word of encouragement, or simply stand in silent solidarity. There was a shared understanding of their plight, a common enemy in hunger and economic collapse, but it could also breed resentment, especially if someone was perceived as trying to jump the line or take more than their fair share. The desperation was a powerful force, capable of bringing out both the best and the worst in people. So you stand there, shuffling forward, the aroma of baking bread, if you're near a bakery, both a torment and a promise. The breadline wasn't just a place to get food, it was a social phenomenon, a daily ritual of hardship for millions. It was a place where the abstract economic statistics became heartbreakingly human. It was the face of hunger, etched onto the anxious faces of your neighbours, your friends, and perhaps your own reflection in a shop window as you waited and waited for that precious, life-sustaining loaf. The government's initial hesitancy we discussed earlier, this is where it hit the pavement, literally. This was the human cost of inaction, measured in hours of waiting and grams of bread. While breadlines offered a stark, often meagre form of sustenance, another institution rose to prominence as a symbol of Depression-era hunger and charity, the soup kitchen. If the breadline was a quick, desperate grab for a loaf, the soup kitchen often represented a slightly more organised, if still woefully inadequate, attempt to provide a warm meal. Yet the very prevalence of these charitable kitchens, and the thin, watery soup they so often served, became a powerful indictment of the systemic failure to keep people fed. Imagine the scene: a dimly lit church basement, a hastily converted storefront, or a community hall. The air is thick with the smell of simmering soup, often a thin broth with a few vegetables, maybe some beans or potatoes, rarely any meat. Long, rough wooden tables and benches fill the space. You file in, perhaps after another long wait outside, clutching a tin cup or a battered bowl if you were told to bring one. The volunteers, often women from local churches or community groups, ladle out the soup with weary but compassionate expressions. They're doing their best, stretched to their limits, trying to make a little go a long way. The soup itself was a marvel of economy, designed to feed the maximum number of people with the minimum of ingredients. Recipes for depression soup often involved boiling bones for hours to extract every last bit of flavour and nutrition. If you were lucky enough to have bones, then adding whatever cheap vegetables were available: onions, carrots, cabbage, potatoes. Sometimes the only meat was a bit of salt pork or bacon grease for flavouring. It was, by necessity, often bland and watery. The phrase thin soup became a common descriptor, a metaphor for the inadequate charity that, while well-intentioned, could barely keep the wolf of starvation from the door. One fairly mainstream historical fact is the sheer number of these operations. By the early 1930s, almost every city and many larger towns had multiple soup kitchens, run by a patchwork of organisations: the Salvation Army, religious denominations, local relief committees, and, as we mentioned, even figures like Al Capone. In New York City alone, by 1931, there were estimated to be over 80 soup kitchens, serving tens of thousands of meals daily. This wasn't a fringe activity. It was a widespread, essential part of the survival network for a huge segment of the population. You sit at the rough table, shoulder to shoulder with other hungry souls. The clatter of spoons against tin bowls is the loudest sound, punctuated by coughs and quiet murmurs. There's not much conversation. Eating is a serious business when you're truly hungry. You savour every spoonful, no matter how thin the broth, because you don't know where your next meal, or even if your next meal, is coming from. The warmth of the soup, at least, is comforting, especially on a cold day. It's a temporary reprieve, a moment of relative solace in a day filled with uncertainty and hardship. A rather quirky, and perhaps apocryphal, fringe tidbit that circulated was the idea of stone soup. The folk tale, which existed long before the Depression but gained renewed currency, tells of clever travellers who convince villagers to contribute ingredients to a pot of soup, supposedly started with just a stone and water. Each villager adds a little something, a carrot, a potato, an onion, until a hearty stew is created. While not literal practice in soup kitchens, they weren't trying to trick anyone. The story resonated. It spoke to the idea of collective effort, of making something from almost nothing, which was the daily challenge for both those running the kitchens and those relying on them. It also perhaps subtly highlighted how little individual contributions often felt in the face of overwhelming need. You might only have one carrot to offer the communal pot. Historians still argue about the overall nutritional adequacy of the food provided in these soup kitchens. While they undoubtedly prevented outright starvation for many, the meals were often severely lacking in essential vitamins, minerals, and protein. A diet consisting primarily of thin soup and bread day after day could lead to malnutrition and related health problems, even if it filled your stomach temporarily. Was it better than nothing? Absolutely. Was it a sustainable solution to a national food crisis? Clearly not. It was a stopgap, a band-aid on a gaping wound. The debate often centres on whether these charitable efforts, by providing a minimal level of subsistence, inadvertently allowed the government to delay more comprehensive and effective relief measures. Did they let the authorities off the hook to some extent? The experience of eating in a soup kitchen, like waiting in a breadline, was often accompanied by a sense of shame and loss of dignity for people unaccustomed to charity. You were publicly acknowledging your inability to provide for yourself. Some kitchens tried to mitigate this by creating a more welcoming, less institutional atmosphere, but the underlying reality was hard to escape. You were dependent on the kindness of strangers for your daily bread, or in this case, your daily bowl of soup. There were also practical challenges. Keeping the kitchen supplied with ingredients was a constant struggle. Donations of food and money were often unpredictable. Volunteers burned out. Maintaining hygiene standards in crowded makeshift facilities was difficult. Sometimes the food itself could be of questionable quality, leftovers donated by restaurants or markets that were on the verge of spoiling. You ate what was offered, because the alternative was an empty plate. You might finish your soup and bread, offer a quiet word of thanks to the volunteers, and head back out into the harsh reality of the streets, the gnawing hunger already beginning to return. The soup kitchen was a temporary haven, but it couldn't solve the fundamental problem of your unemployment, your lost savings, or the collapsed economy. It was a symptom of the crisis, not a cure. The image of people lining up for that thin soup day after day became another powerful visual shorthand for the era, a constant reminder of how precarious life had become, and how the promise of American abundance had, for so many, been boiled down to a ladleful of watery broth. Remember that talk of fancy Jell-O salads from the Roaring Twenties? Those days felt like a distant, almost unimaginable dream as you scraped the last drop of thin vegetable soup from your bowl. If the breadlines and soup kitchens represented a desperate, organised plea for food within the cities, the shanty towns that sprang up on their peripheries showcased a more rugged and often more wretched form of survival. These were the infamous Hoovervilles, grimly named after the president many blamed for their plight. Here, in these makeshift communities of the dispossessed, scavenging for food wasn't just an occasional necessity, it was a daily, all-consuming preoccupation, a raw and visceral struggle for existence. Imagine you've lost your home, evicted for non-payment of rent, or perhaps your farm foreclosed. You've drifted to the city in a desperate search for work that doesn't exist. With no money and nowhere to go, you find yourself on the fringes, along riverbanks, in vacant lots near railroad tracks, or on the city dump. Here, clusters of shacks have sprouted like bitter weeds. These are the Hoovervilles. Your new home, if you can call it that, is pieced together from whatever scraps you can find. Discarded lumber, packing crates, bits of tin, cardboard, old tar paper, even the bodies of derelict automobiles. There's no electricity, no running water, no sanitation. It's a landscape of extreme poverty and makeshift ingenuity. And in this landscape, finding food is the paramount concern, from the moment you wake in your cold, damp shack until you huddle down for a fitful sleep. Organised charity like soup kitchens might be miles away, or the queues too long, or you might simply be too proud or too broken to seek it out regularly. So, you scavenge. You become intimately familiar with the geography of refuse. The city dump becomes a grim sort of grocery store. You join other families, men, women, and shockingly, young children, picking through mounds of garbage, hoping to find a discarded vegetable, a piece of stale bread, a bone with some meat still clinging to it, or anything remotely edible. The competition can be fierce. The smell is overpowering. The risks of food poisoning or disease are constant. You learn to look for restaurants or markets that might be throwing out spoiled or unsaleable food at the end of the day. Sometimes, a sympathetic cook or shopkeeper might quietly set aside scraps, but more often, it's a furtive, hurried search through bins behind establishments, always wary of being chased away. You might see children, their faces smudged with dirt, their clothes ragged, darting in to grab a wilted lettuce leaf or a bruised apple before scurrying back to their shacks. It's a heartbreaking sight, the innocence of childhood lost to the grim realities of hunger. A mainstream historical fact is that some of these Hoovervilles became semi-permanent settlements, with populations in the thousands, developing their own informal social structures and economies out of sheer necessity. The largest ones, like the one in St. Louis, even had their own unofficial mayors. Beyond the dump and the bins, foraging took other forms. If your Hooverville was near a river or a lake, you might try fishing, often with crude homemade tackle. Any small creature, a pigeon, a squirrel, a rabbit, if you were incredibly lucky and far enough from the city centre, could become a desperately needed source of protein. People would gather wild greens, dandelions, or any edible plants they could identify, though the risk of picking something poisonous was ever present. This was a far cry from the idyllic image of a farmer harvesting his own crops. This was urban hunting and gathering at its most desperate. A particularly quirky and grim illustration of the lengths people would go to was the phenomenon of Hoover hogs, or Hoover chickens. These weren't actual pigs or chickens, but rather jackrabbits or even large rats, hunted and eaten out of sheer desperation. While perhaps not a widespread practice in all Hoovervilles, the stories and the slang terms themselves speak to the extreme scarcity and the breakdown of normal dietary taboos. When you're starving, your definition of edible becomes remarkably flexible. You might hear dark jokes about roof rabbit, cat meat, or other unappetizing protein sources, a grim humour that barely masks the underlying horror. Historians still debate the level of social cohesion versus social breakdown within these Hoovervilles. Were they chaotic, dangerous places rife with crime and exploitation? Or did shared adversity foster a strong sense of community and mutual support? The reality was likely a complex mix of both. There are accounts of remarkable kindness, of families sharing their meagre finds, of people looking out for each other, but there are also stories of theft, violence, and despair. When survival is on the line, human nature is tested to its absolute limits. The lack of sanitation and clean water inevitably led to outbreaks of diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and tuberculosis, further weakening already malnourished bodies. The food you did manage to scavenge or beg was often cooked over open fires, in dented pots or old cans. The meals were meagre, repetitive, and profoundly unsatisfying. A typical Hooverville stew might consist of a few scavenged vegetables, perhaps thickened with a little flour if you had it, boiled in water. There was no concept of a balanced diet. It was about staving off the worst pangs of hunger for another day. The children especially suffered. Their growth stunted, their immune systems compromised. They were the most vulnerable victims of this chronic food insecurity. The existence of Hoovervilles, these visible scars on the American landscape, was a constant embarrassing reminder of the depth of the crisis. They stood in stark contrast to the gleaming skyscrapers of the cities they adjoined, a testament to the broken promise of prosperity. For you, living in such a place, life is stripped down to its barest essentials. The comforts of your old life, a warm bed, a clean kitchen, a stocked pantry, are distant, painful memories. Now, your world revolves around the next search for scraps, the next meagre meal, the constant gnawing hunger that defines your days and haunts your nights. The food didn't just suck in the Hoovervilles, it was a desperate daily gamble for survival itself, played out amongst the refuse of a broken economy. While city dwellers queued in breadlines, shivered in soup kitchens, or scavenged in Hoovervilles, a different, almost surreal, kind of food tragedy was unfolding in the American countryside, particularly in areas not directly ravaged by the Dust Bowl's black blizzards. It was the farmer's paradox, a situation where, in many regions, crops were abundant, fields were fertile, and livestock was plentiful, yet millions of people, including many farmers themselves, were going hungry. Food was there, sometimes rotting in the fields or being deliberately destroyed, because the economic system that should have connected that food to empty stomachs had utterly collapsed. Imagine you're a farmer, say in the Midwest or parts of the South, not directly in the Dust Bowl but still caught in the Depression's iron grip. You've worked hard, planted your crops, tended your animals. The harvest is good, maybe a bumper crop of corn, a field full of ripe tomatoes, or hogs fattened for market. In normal times, this would be cause for celebration. But these are not normal times. You take your produce to market, or wait for the buyer to come to your farm, and the prices offered are so devastatingly low that they don't even cover your costs of production. The seed, the fertilizer, if you could afford it, the fuel for your tractor, if you hadn't already lost it to the bank. The reason for these catastrophically low prices was a massive drop in demand, both domestically and internationally. People in the cities, unemployed and penniless as we've seen, simply couldn't afford to buy food, even at rock-bottom prices. Export markets, crucial for American agriculture, had dried up due to international financial collapse and retaliatory tariffs like the Smoot-Hawley tariff we touched on earlier. So, you have this absurd situation. Mountains of food on one side, and millions of hungry mouths on the other, with a broken economic bridge between them. What do? You can't afford to transport your goods to distant markets for pennies. You can't afford to store them indefinitely, as many perishable goods will spoil. So with a heavy heart, you might be forced to make unthinkable choices. Stories from the era are replete with accounts of farmers dumping thousands of gallons of milk into ditches because the price offered by dairy processors was less than the cost of transportation. Imagine pouring out that life-giving milk while knowing children in the cities were suffering from a lack of it. Oranges were reportedly left to rot on the trees in California groves. Mountains of potatoes were sometimes doused with kerosene to make them inedible, or guarded to prevent the hungry from taking them, all in a desperate attempt by farmer cooperatives or individuals to prop up prices by reducing supply. A stark historical fact is the widespread organised destruction of agricultural products. For example, under the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, part of Roosevelt's New Deal, which we'll get to, the government actually paid farmers to plough under a percentage of their planted crops and to slaughter millions of young pigs. The aim was to reduce surpluses and thereby raise prices for agricultural goods to a level that would allow farmers to survive. While economically rational from a certain perspective, if farmers went bankrupt, there'd be even less food in the long run. The sight of perfectly good food being deliberately destroyed while so many were starving was morally repugnant to many and incredibly controversial. 6 million young pigs were slaughtered in 1933 alone under this programme, with much of the meat unfortunately going to waste or being converted into inedible products like fertiliser, though some was distributed as relief. This leads to a quirky and bitter saying that gained currency among farmers: starved to death in a land of plenty. It perfectly encapsulated the cruel irony of their situation. They were surrounded by abundance, yet they couldn't make a living. Many farmers were, in fact, going hungry themselves. They might have food growing in their fields, but they had no cash for other necessities: clothes, shoes, medicine, fuel, or to pay the mortgage on their farm. Foreclosures were rampant. The very people who produced the nation's food were losing their land and their livelihoods. Historians still argue fiercely about the ethics and effectiveness of the AAA's crop and livestock destruction policies. Was it a necessary evil to save American agriculture from total collapse, thereby ensuring a food supply in the future? Or was it a callous and short-sighted policy that exacerbated immediate suffering and created a dangerous precedent of artificial scarcity? There's no easy answer. Supporters would say it was a desperate measure for desperate times, and that it did eventually help stabilise farm incomes. Critics would point to the immediate human cost and the moral outrage of destroying food amidst widespread hunger. You, as a farmer, might find yourself in this agonising position. Your barn is full of corn, but you can't sell it for enough to buy your children's shoes. You have milk, but the local creamery offers you pennies per gallon. So what do you do with the surplus? You might feed it to your own livestock if you still have them and can afford to keep them. You might try to barter it locally, a bushel of apples for some sugar from the local store if the storekeeper is willing. Some farming communities organised penny auctions, where, when a neighbour's farm was being foreclosed and auctioned, community members would bid mere pennies for the land and equipment, then return it to the original owner, effectively thwarting the banks. This was a form of direct, localised resistance against the economic forces crushing them. The sight of food rotting in fields or being deliberately destroyed while people in nearby towns and cities were starving created immense bitterness and frustration. It highlighted the fundamental irrationality of an economic system that could allow such a thing to happen. It wasn't a problem of production, it was a problem of distribution and purchasing power. The food was there, the hunger was there, but the connection was broken. This paradox of want amidst plenty was one of the most baffling and infuriating aspects of the Great Depression's food crisis, and it fueled a growing anger that would soon spill over in more dramatic ways. The frustration wasn't just about your own empty stomach, it was about the sheer, maddening senselessness of it all. The sight of rotting food juxtaposed with starving families, the endless breadlines, the inadequate soup, the desperation of Hoovervilles, and the government's initially hesitant response. All these ingredients simmered together in a cauldron of public frustration. Eventually, that frustration began to boil over. Hunger, when it becomes desperate enough, can transform into a potent, unpredictable force. It can turn quiet despair into vocal outrage, and in some instances into direct physical action. The early 1930s saw a rise in food-related protests, demonstrations, and even riots, as people pushed to the brink decided they had nothing left to lose. Imagine the scene: a small town in Arkansas, or a working-class neighbourhood in a larger city like Detroit or Minneapolis. A crowd has gathered, not in a patient shuffling breadline, but in an agitated, angry throng. They might be outside a grocery store whose owner is accused of hoarding or price gouging. They might be marching on the local relief office demanding more aid or more dignified treatment. Or they might be a group of farmers, blocking a road to prevent foreclosures or to stop low-priced agricultural products from reaching the market, a desperate attempt to control the forces that were bankrupting them. These weren't centrally organised nationwide movements in the early days, but rather spontaneous flare-ups of collective anger. One of the most well-documented early instances, often cited as a turning point, occurred in England, Arkansas, in January 1931. Several hundred desperate farmers, many of them white landowners, accompanied by their black sharecroppers, a rare instance of interracial cooperation born of shared misery, marched into the town demanding food. They were hungry, their families were hungry, and they had been denied Red Cross relief supplies they believed they were entitled to. When faced with polite refusals and bureaucratic runaround from local merchants and officials, their patience snapped. They began to peacefully but firmly take food, flour, lard, coffee, sugar, from the shelves of stores, promising to pay when they could, but making it clear they would not let their families starve. Local authorities, overwhelmed and perhaps sympathetic, largely stood by. This event sent shockwaves across the country, a clear signal that people's endurance was wearing thin. You might find yourself swept up in such a crowd. Perhaps you're a mother, unable to bear the sight of your children's hungry faces any longer, or a laid-off factory worker, your pride eroded by months of unemployment and fruitless searching. The mood is tense, volatile. Speeches are made, voices are raised. There's a sense of shared grievance, a collective realization that we're all in this together, and something has to be done. The fear that normally keeps people in check, fear of arrest, fear of social disapproval, begins to recede, replaced by the more primal fear of starvation and the anger of injustice. A notable historical fact is the rise of hunger marches and organised protests by unemployed councils, often led by communists or socialists, who were quick to capitalise on the widespread discontent. These groups organised demonstrations in major cities, demanding unemployment insurance, cash relief, and public works programmes. While often met with police repression, sometimes brutally, these marches helped to publicise the extent of the suffering and put pressure on local, state, and federal governments to act. The Bonus Army March of World War I veterans on Washington, D.C. in 1932, demanding early payment of a promised bonus, while not solely about food, was deeply intertwined with the economic desperation that left many veterans and their families hungry. Their violent dispersal by the US Army under Hoover's orders further damaged his administration's image and fueled public anger. Beyond organised marches, there were more spontaneous, localised food riots. These often involved crowds, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, storming grocery stores and taking food. In Minneapolis in 1931, several such incidents occurred where crowds smashed store windows and seized groceries. Similar events were reported in other cities. These were acts of desperation, not usually of wanton looting for profit. People took necessities, bread, meat, canned goods. Often, after the initial outburst, the crowd would disperse quickly. It was a raw expression of the breaking point. A quirky and rather telling aspect of some of these food-related disturbances was the specific targeting. Sometimes, anger was directed at chain stores, which were seen by some as impersonal entities draining money from local communities, or at merchants believed to be unfairly profiting from scarcity. Other times, the protests were more about demanding action from authorities. For instance, there were milk strikes, where dairy farmers, protesting ruinously low milk prices, would try to forcibly prevent non-striking farmers from delivering their milk to processors, sometimes dumping the milk on the highways. Imagine the sight. Rivers of precious milk flowing down the road, a symbol of both desperate protest and tragic waste. Historians still argue about how close the United States came to a full-scale revolution during the depths of the Depression. While these food riots and hunger marches were certainly alarming and indicated deep social unrest, most historians believe the country was not on the verge of systemic collapse or widespread armed insurrection. The tradition of democratic institutions, however strained, and the lack of a unified revolutionary leadership, among other factors, likely prevented things from escalating further. However, it's undeniable that the social fabric was stretched dangerously thin, and the fear of more widespread disorder was a significant factor in prompting more robust government intervention, particularly with the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt. For you, caught in this rising tide of anger, the world feels increasingly unstable. The old rules don't seem to apply. The authorities, who are supposed to maintain order and provide security, seem either overwhelmed or indifferent. Taking part in a food protest, or even just witnessing one, is a frightening and radicalizing experience. It shatters any remaining illusions about the stability of the system. You see your neighbours, ordinary, law-abiding people, driven to acts they would never have contemplated in normal times. The hunger isn't just a pain in your stomach anymore. It's a fire in your belly, a righteous anger that demands to be heard. The thin soup of charity is no longer enough. The empty promises of prosperity, just around the corner, ring hollow. What people are starting to demand is not just a handout, but fundamental change, a system that ensures the right to eat. The farmer's paradox of plenty amidst want was an absurdity. These protests were the anguished human cry against that absurdity. The simmering rage, the food riots, the desperate marches, and the sheer scale of human suffering finally created an undeniable pressure for a more decisive and comprehensive federal response. The election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932 ushered in an era of unprecedented government intervention, famously known as the New Deal. While the New Deal encompassed a vast array of programs aimed at relief, recovery and reform, one of its earliest and most impactful initiatives directly addressed the crisis in food and agriculture. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, passed in May 1933. The question on everyone's mind, especially if your stomach was rumbling, was, would this New Deal bring new hope for a reliable food supply? Imagine the shift in mood. After years of what felt like official indifference or ineffective tinkering, suddenly there's a whirlwind of activity from Washington. Roosevelt's voice on the radio in his fireside chats is calm, reassuring, and crucially sounds like he gets it. He's acknowledging the suffering and promising action. For many, this alone is a source of immense relief. The LAA was a cornerstone of his early agricultural policy, a bold and highly controversial attempt to tackle that farmer's paradox we talked about, the one where abundant crops were leading to ruinous prices and widespread farm foreclosures, while city folks starved. The core idea behind the AAA was, in essence, to raise agricultural prices by reducing surpluses. If you, as a farmer, were struggling because you were producing too much corn, cotton, wheat, rice, hogs, or dairy, and the market price was below your cost of production, the AA offered a deal. The government would pay you subsidies, direct payments, in return for you voluntarily reducing the amount of land you planted with these specific commodities, or for reducing your livestock herds. The funds for these subsidies were to be generated by a tax levied on the companies that processed these agricultural products: millers, meat packers, cotton ginners, etc. This was a radical departure from previous government policy. Instead of just letting the market sort itself out, which clearly wasn't working, the government was now actively intervening to manage agricultural supply. One of the most immediate and shocking manifestations of this policy, as we briefly touched upon in Section 9, was the infamous ploughing under of about 10 million acres of cotton that had already been planted in the spring of 1933, and the slaughter of over 6 million young pigs and 200,000 sows. You can imagine the outcry. Destroying perfectly good cotton when people needed clothes, and slaughtering young animals when people were hungry, seemed insane, almost sacrilegious to many observers. Even Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace, who oversaw the programme, called it a shocking commentary on our civilization. However, the economic logic, however harsh, was that this artificial scarcity was necessary to drive prices up to a level where farmers could actually make a living. If farmers went completely bankrupt, the nation's food supply would be even more precarious in the long run. The historical fact is that for many farmers who participated, the AAA did bring some desperately needed relief. Farm incomes began to rise, and the rate of farm foreclosures slowed. For you, if you were a farmer growing one of these designated crops, that government check might have been the difference between losing your farm and holding on, between utter destitution and a fragile chance at recovery. But what about the food itself? Did this make food more or less accessible to the hungry in the cities? This is where things get complicated. In the short term, by reducing supply, the Desperation arguably contributed to slightly higher food prices for consumers, which wasn't great news if you were unemployed and penniless. However, the New Deal also included other programs aimed at direct relief. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERM, also established in 1933, provided funds to states for direct cash relief and work relief, which helped people buy food. More directly, some of the agricultural products acquired by the government through railway programs, like some of that slaughtered pork, after the initial outcry led to better processing and distribution efforts, were distributed to the needy through relief channels. The Federal Surplus Relief Corporation, FSRC, was created later in 1933 specifically to purchase surplus agricultural commodities and distribute them to families on relief. So, you might actually receive a can of government beef or a bag of government flour, a direct result of these agricultural policies. A quirky, and perhaps lesser known aspect of the AA's impact was on sharecroppers and tenant farmers, particularly African Americans in the South. While the LLA aimed to help landowners, the benefits didn't always trickle down fairly to those who worked the land, but didn't own it. Landowners receiving payments for taking land out of production sometimes evicted their tenants or sharecroppers as they needed fewer labourers. Or they might keep the subsidy payments for themselves rather than sharing them appropriately. This led to increased hardship for some of the most vulnerable agricultural workers and was a significant flaw in the programme's implementation. There were even plough-up riots in some areas where tenants tried to resist being removed from land taken out of cultivation. Historians still argue about the overall success and long-term consequences of Deal AAA. It was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1936 on the grounds that the processing tax used to fund it was an illegal infringement on states' rights, and that regulating agriculture was beyond federal power. However, Congress quickly passed a revised version, the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act, and then a second TA in 1938, which achieved similar goals through different mechanisms, like payments for soil conservation practices that also happened to reduce crop acreage. Did the A solve the agricultural crisis? Not entirely, but it marked a fundamental shift in the government's role in agriculture, establishing a system of price supports and supply management that, in various forms, continues to this day. Some argue it created an unhealthy dependency on government subsidies and distorted market forces, while others maintain it was a necessary intervention that saved countless farms and helped stabilise a vital sector of the economy during a desperate time. For you, trying to navigate the daily struggle for food, the New Deal and the A brought a complex mix of hope and frustration. If you were a farmer of a key commodity, you might see a path, however narrow, out of ruin. If you were a consumer, You might hope that the broader economic recovery efforts would eventually mean more jobs and more purchasing power, or that relief programs would provide a more consistent safety net. The deliberate destruction of food remained a bitter pill for many to swallow, but the sense that the government was finally trying, on a massive scale, to do something tangible was a powerful psychological boost. The food situation was still dire for millions, but the landscape of despair was, for the first time in years, punctuated by flickers of federally fueled hope. The question was whether that hope could translate fast enough into actual food on your table. The New Deal's agricultural policies, like the AAA, were aimed at the systemic long-term issues of food production and pricing. But on the ground, in your kitchen, the daily reality was still one of scarcity and the relentless challenge of making something, anything, edible out of very little. This necessity became the mother of some truly remarkable and often rather unappetizing culinary inventions. These were the Desperation dinners, the creative, sometimes bizarre recipes that families concocted to stretch meagre ingredients and fill empty stomachs. If food sucked in general during the Depression, some of these specific dishes really took it to another level of suckitude. Imagine your pantry. It's not exactly bare, thanks to some relief flour, maybe a few potatoes, and a can of something government issued. But it's a far cry from abundance. You have a family to feed. What do you make? This is where ingenuity and a strong stomach came into play. Housewives, and it was almost always the women who bore this burden, became culinary chemists, experimenting with combinations and substitutions that would make a modern foodie's hair curl. Cookbooks of the era, or more often, handwritten notes and shared tips passed between neighbours, offer a glimpse into this world of make-do cuisine. One infamous example, a true icon of Depression-era gastronomy, was Hoover Stew or Depression stew. There wasn't one single recipe, it was more of a concept. The base was usually macaroni or some other cheap pasta, cooked with whatever vegetables were on hand, often canned tomatoes, maybe some onions, carrots, or peas if you were lucky. The meat component was frequently hot dogs sliced up and thrown in. Hot dogs were cheap, readily available, and provided a bit of protein and flavour. Sometimes there was no meat at all. It was filling, it was hot, and it could feed a crowd on a shoestring budget. You might also encounter variations using potatoes or beans as the primary filler instead of pasta. Not exactly haute cuisine, but it kept body and soul together more or less. Another classic of the era was cream chipped beef on toast, affectionately, or not so affectionately, nicknamed S.O.S. by soldiers, which stands for, well, let's just say stew on a shingle, or same old stuff for PG-13 purposes. Dried beef, which was salty and shelf-stable, was rehydrated and then cooked in a simple white sauce made from flour, milk, or even water with a little evaporated milk, and butter or margarine if you had it. This concoction was then ladled over slices of toasted bread. It was cheap, salty, and surprisingly enduring. Versions of it still appear on some diner menus today, a strange culinary fossil from harder times. A key historical fact regarding Depression-era cooking was the heavy reliance on extenders and fillers. Bread was, of course, a primary staple. Meat, when available, was stretched with breadcrumbs, crackers, oatmeal or rice, in dishes like meatloaf, which often contained very little actual meat, or casseroles. Vegetables were used to bulk out main courses. Nothing was wasted. Bacon grease was saved for cooking and flavouring. Stale bread was turned into bread pudding, often made with water instead of milk, or bread crumbs. Potato peelings might even be fried up if they were clean enough. It was a constant battle to make a little seem like a lot. One particularly quirky, and frankly rather grim, category of Desperation dinners involved Jell-O. Yes, that wobbly wonder from the 1920s made a comeback, but in far more utilitarian forms. Remember those congealed salads? During the Depression, they became less about novelty and more about stretching scarce ingredients. Perfection salad might sound appealing, but it often involved lemon or lime Jell-O mixed with shredded cabbage, carrots, celery, pimento, and sometimes olives or even vinegar. There were also Jell-O concoctions that incorporated leftover cooked meat or fish, creating savoury aspects that are, to modern palates, often deeply unappealing. The logic was that Jell-O was cheap, it could suspend and extend other more expensive ingredients, and it looked like you were making an effort, even if the result was questionable. One popular one was mock apple pie, where the apples were actually Ritz crackers soaked in lemon juice and syrup, then baked in a pie crust. Resourceful? Yes. Delicious? Debatable. Historians still argue about the overall nutritional impact of these Depression-era diets. While people were incredibly resourceful in finding ways to fill their stomachs, the meals were often very high in carbohydrates, from bread, potatoes, pasta, and low in essential vitamins, minerals, and good quality protein. Fresh fruits and vegetables were luxuries for many. This led to widespread malnutrition, even if outright starvation was staved off. Conditions like rickets, from vitamin D deficiency, pellagra, from niacin deficiency, especially in the south where diets were heavily corn-based, and anemia were common. So while these desperation dinners were a testament to human resilience and ingenuity, they also tell a story of hidden hunger and its long-term health consequences, which we'll explore more later. You, in your 1930s kitchen, become an expert at this kind of culinary improvisation. You learn to make mock versions of favourite dishes. Mock chicken legs might be made from ground pork or veal mixed with rice, moulded onto skewers, and fried. Mock sausage could be concocted from lentils and breadcrumbs. You learn all the tricks for making stale bread palatable, for turning scraps into something resembling a meal. Your recipe collection, if you have one, is probably full of dishes with names like poor man's potato soup, economical stew, or thrifty casserole. There was even a trend for mystery dishes, sometimes served at community potlucks, if anyone had anything to contribute. One such dish, sometimes called surprise loaf, involved layers of various leftovers, often unidentifiable, baked together. Eating it was a culinary gamble. The humour surrounding these dishes was often a coping mechanism. People joked about their strange meals because otherwise they might have cried. These desperation dinners weren't just about physical sustenance. They were also about maintaining a semblance of normalcy, of family ritual, in a world that felt increasingly abnormal and chaotic. The act of preparing a meal, however humble, and sitting down to eat it together was a small but important way to preserve family cohesion and dignity. But there's no romanticising it. These were often grim, unappetizing meals born of extreme hardship. The creativity was admirable, but the circumstances that demanded it were tragic. That Hoover Stew, bubbling away on your stove, was a daily reminder of how far your standard of living had fallen, and how much food, real, satisfying food, truly sucked during the Great Depression. The desperation dinners we just talked about were a testament to ingenuity, but they were often built upon a foundation of very basic, often monotonous ingredients. The real art form for many households during the Great Depression wasn't just inventing new dishes, but mastering the art of stretching the absolute tiniest scraps of food to their utmost limit. It was about fillers, extenders, and a kind of culinary alchemy that aimed to turn scarcity into something that could, at least temporarily, appease a hungry belly. Every crumb counted, every spoonful was precious. Imagine your kitchen counter. You have a small piece of leftover meat from yesterday, maybe a few spoonfuls of that S.O.S chipped beef, or the very end of a small roast. In better times, this might have been a snack for one person. Now, it needs to become part of a meal for the whole family. This is where the stretching began. That meat would be meticulously chopped or shredded, then extended with anything cheap and filling you could find. Breadcrumbs were a go-to, as we mentioned. If you had stale bread, it was never thrown out. It was dried in the oven, if you could afford the fuel, and ground into crumbs, or soaked in water or milk, if you had it, to become a panada to bulk out meat patties or loaves. Potatoes were another hero of the stretch meal. They were cheap, versatile, and filling. A small amount of meat could be lost in a large pot of potato stew or hash. Mashed potatoes could make a meagre serving of gravy seem more substantial. Even the water potatoes were boiled in might be saved as a base for soup, as it contained a little starch and people hoped some nutrients. Similarly, rice and beans, age-old staples of frugal diets, played a starring role. A handful of beans, cooked slowly for hours, could provide a protein-rich, though often incomplete base for a meal, stretched further with rice or cornmeal. Remember those Hoover apples? Raw potatoes? That's the extreme end of relying on a single cheap filler. A common practice was making gravy out of almost anything to pour over bread or potatoes, making them more palatable and giving the illusion of a richer meal. If you had little bacon grease, you could mix it with flour and water, or milk if you were flush, to make a simple grease gravy. If you had a bouillon cube, that could be turned into a thin broth. Even browned flour and water with salt and pepper could pass as a mock gravy in the direst of circumstances. The goal was to add moisture and a hint of flavour to the otherwise bland starches that formed the bulk of the diet. One rather mainstream historical fact is the rise in popularity and reliance on canned goods, especially those distributed by relief agencies. Canned tomatoes, canned corned beef, often referred to as canned willy or monkey meat, canned peas and evaporated milk became familiar items in many pantries. While not always the most nutritious or appetizing, they were shelf-stable and provided a baseline of sustenance. A can of tomatoes could be stretched into a soup with water and a few onions, or poured over toast. A can of corned beef could be fried up with potatoes to make corned beef hash, a dish that became a Depression-era classic precisely because it was a good way to stretch a small amount of meat. A quirky and somewhat sad example of stretching scraps involved coffee and tea. As we touched on before, coffee grounds were often reboiled multiple times. Some people would save used tea leaves, dry them out, and try to get another weak infusion from them. There were even stories of people trying to roast and grind acorns or chicory root as coffee substitutes when real coffee became an unaffordable luxury. It wasn't just about stretching food for meals, but stretching any small comfort or routine that made life feel a little more normal. You might also see people meticulously scraping out cans and jars with a spatula, or even their fingers, to get every last bit. The concept of licking the plate clean took on a whole new meaning. Historians still argue about the extent to which these practices of extreme frugality and stretching became permanently ingrained in the generation that lived through the Depression. Many who grew up during this era carried a lifelong aversion to waste, a habit of saving string, reusing containers, and eating every last scrap on their plate. Was this purely a learned behaviour from years of scarcity, or did it also reflect a deeper psychological impact, a lingering fear of future want? It's likely a combination, but the waste not, want not philosophy was certainly powerfully reinforced by the daily realities of the 1930s. You find yourself becoming an expert in this economy of scraps. You save every bacon dripping, every vegetable peeling, for soup stock if clean, every crust of bread. You learn to make a thin soup seem heartier with a spoonful of leftover mashed potato. You might add a beaten egg, if you could afford one, to stretch a small amount of ground meat further when making patties. Sauces and gravies become your best friends, transforming bland piles of starch into something vaguely more interesting. Even the presentation mattered. Arranging a meagre meal as attractively as possible on the plate, even if it was just potatoes and gravy, was a small act of preserving dignity. The resourcefulness was truly remarkable. Women's magazines of the period, those that survived, were full of tips on thrifty meals and budget cookery. They'd offer recipes for using up leftovers in creative and sometimes not so creative ways. There was a constant search for new ways to make less feel like more. This wasn't about culinary flair, it was about survival. It was about the gnawing responsibility of feeding a family when the resources were almost non-existent. The food might have sucked in terms of variety, nutrition, and sheer pleasure, but the effort that went into preparing it, into stretching those precious scraps, was often heroic. It was a daily battle waged in kitchens across the country, a quiet, often unacknowledged struggle against hunger. That piece of string you saved, that carefully hoarded bacon grease, that extra potato peeled into the stew, these weren't just acts of frugality. They were acts of love and resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. The endless parade of Hoover Stews, S.O.S, and meals stretched with potatoes and bread might have kept outright starvation at bay for many, but it came at a hidden, insidious cost: widespread nutritional deficiencies. While your stomach might feel temporarily full after a plate of starchy makeshift fare, your body was often crying out for the essential vitamins, minerals, and proteins it wasn't receiving. This hidden hunger led to a host of serious health problems, subtly undermining the strength and well-being of a generation. Imagine you're a child growing up in the 1930s. Your diet consists primarily of bread, potatoes, maybe some beans, and if you're lucky, a bit of canned meat or a thin vegetable soup. Fresh fruits, green leafy vegetables, and dairy products like milk and cheese are rare treats if they appear at all. You might not feel acutely hungry all the time, especially after a filling starchy meal, but you might notice you're tired a lot. Your energy levels are low, you catch colds easily and they seem to linger forever. Perhaps your gums bleed, or you have strange sores on your skin that won't heal. These are the quiet, creeping signs of malnutrition. One of the most significant and well-documented health problems linked to Depression-era diets was pellagra. This disease is caused by a deficiency of niacin, vitamin B3, and was particularly prevalent in the American South, where diets heavily reliant on corn, which is low in absorbable niacin, fatback and molasses were common even before the Depression and worsened during it. The symptoms of pellagra are often remembered by the 4 Ds: dermatitis, a dark, scaly rash, especially on skin exposed to sunlight, diarrhea, dementia, including confusion, memory loss, and depression, and, if untreated, death. A stark historical fact is that pellagra reached epidemic proportions in the South during the early 1930s, with hundreds of thousands of cases reported. It was a slow, debilitating illness that profoundly affected people's ability to work and function. Dr. Joseph Goldberger of the US Public Health Service had identified the dietary cause of pellagra years earlier, but poverty prevented many from accessing the necessary foods, like meat, milk, and yeast, to prevent or cure it. Rickets, a condition caused by vitamin D deficiency that leads to soft, misshapen bones, was another serious concern, especially for children in urban areas with limited sunlight exposure and poor diets. Bowed legs and stunted growth became visible markers of this nutritional lack. Vitamin C deficiency, leading to scurvy, symptoms include bleeding gums, loose teeth, and joint pain, also saw a resurgence, as fresh fruits and vegetables became unaffordable luxuries for many. Even if you weren't suffering from a full-blown deficiency disease, a general lack of essential vitamins and minerals weakened your immune system, making you far more susceptible to infectious diseases like tuberculosis, pneumonia, and influenza, which were major killers at the time. A quirky and rather sad reflection of the times was the marketing of certain health products that promised to combat these deficiencies, often with dubious efficacy. Cod liver oil, rich in vitamins A and D, was widely promoted and given to children, despite its notoriously unpleasant taste. It became a dreaded daily ritual for many youngsters, a spoonful of fishy oil forced down in the name of health. Yeast, a good source of B vitamins, was also marketed as a health supplement, sometimes in tablet form or as an additive to food. Whether these products made a significant dent in the overall problem for the masses is debatable, but their popularity highlights the public anxiety about poor nutrition. You might also see advertisements for fortified foods, an early recognition that the average diet was lacking. Historians still argue about the precise mortality figures directly or indirectly attributable to malnutrition during the Great Depression. Official records might list pneumonia as the cause of death, but a severely malnourished individual is far more likely to succumb to such an infection. It's difficult to disentangle the complex web of poverty, poor diet, inadequate sanitation, especially in Hoovervilles or overcrowded tenements, and disease. However, there is a general consensus that malnutrition significantly contributed to higher rates of morbidity, illness, and likely to increased mortality, particularly among vulnerable populations like children, the elderly, and the chronically ill. The hidden hunger didn't always kill directly, but it weakened the body's defences, making it an easier target for other diseases. You, living through this era, might not have the scientific vocabulary to describe niacin deficiency or vitamin C deficiency, but you see the effects around you. You see children who are undersized and listless. You see neighbours suffering from lingering illnesses. You yourself might feel a constant dragging fatigue that no amount of sleep can cure. The lack of variety in your diet becomes not just a matter of monotony, but a genuine health concern. That endless parade of starchy meals, those desperation dinners made with more ingenuity than nutrients, starts to take its toll on your physical well-being. The efforts of relief agencies to distribute surplus commodities, like canned grapefruit juice, rich in vitamin C, or dried milk powder, were partly aimed at addressing these nutritional gaps. Home economists and public health nurses tried to educate people on how to make the most of their limited food resources, emphasizing the importance of including whatever vegetables or fruits they could obtain. But the scale of the problem was immense. For many, accessing a balanced diet was simply impossible, no matter how much they knew about nutrition. So, while the immediate visceral problem was the empty stomach, the longer-term, more insidious issue was the nutritionally empty food. The Depression didn't just make food suck in terms of taste or availability, it made it suck in terms of its ability to sustain true health and vitality. The constant low-level hunger, or the reliance on filling but nutrient-poor foods, left a legacy of compromised health that would linger for years, even after the worst of the economic crisis had passed. The pallor of your skin, the lack of shine in your hair, the ache in your joints, these were the quiet testimonials to the hidden hunger pains of the era. The hidden hunger pains we just discussed, those widespread nutritional deficiencies, cast a particularly long and cruel shadow over the youngest members of society. Children, with their rapidly growing bodies and developing minds, are uniquely vulnerable to the effects of malnutrition. The food that sucked during the Great Depression didn't just mean uncomfortable hunger pangs for kids. It meant a potential lifetime of compromised health, stunted growth, and diminished cognitive abilities. A generation quite literally bore the physical and developmental scars of this prolonged period of want. Imagine you are a parent during these years, watching your children. You do everything in your power to shield them, to find food, to stretch every last morsel. You might go hungry yourself so they can have a little more, but often it's still not enough, or not the right kind of enough. You see your child, who should be robust and energetic, looking pale and listless. They're not growing as quickly as their older siblings did before the hard times hit. They struggle in school, if they were even able to attend regularly. It's a heartbreaking, powerless feeling. The most visible impact of chronic malnutrition on children was stunted growth. Studies conducted during and after the Depression showed that children from low-income families, who bore the brunt of food insecurity, were often shorter and weighed less than their more affluent peers, or than children from earlier, more prosperous times. This wasn't just a matter of being small for their age. It was a physical manifestation of their bodies not receiving the necessary building blocks, calories, protein, calcium, and other essential nutrients for normal development. Those Depression-era kids often carried that smaller stature with them into adulthood. Beyond just height and weight, dental problems were rampant. A diet high in carbohydrates and sugars, from cheap fillers like bread, potatoes, and perhaps molasses or corn syrup if available, and deficient in calcium and vitamin C, led to widespread tooth decay, gum disease, and tooth loss, even in very young children. Dentists of the era reported seeing appalling levels of dental caries. For many families, dental care was an unaffordable luxury, so a toothache often meant extraction rather than treatment. Imagine a childhood plagued by constant dental pain, on top of the gnawing hunger. A significant historical fact is the documented rise in infant and child mortality rates in some of the hardest-hit areas during the Depression, often linked to diseases exacerbated by malnutrition. While national statistics can sometimes mask regional variations, local studies in particularly distressed communities painted a grim picture. Babies born to malnourished mothers were often underweight and more susceptible to infections. Children weakened by poor diet succumbed more easily to common childhood illnesses like measles, diphtheria, or whooping cough, which are far more dangerous in a malnourished body. The loss of a child, always a tragedy, became an even more bitter blow when you knew that better nutrition might have made a difference. A quirky, or perhaps more accurately poignant, indicator of the focus on child nutrition, or lack thereof, was the intense public interest in child health campaigns and advice columns in newspapers and magazines. Even with limited resources, there was a strong desire among parents to do the best they could. Information on how to prepare nutritious meals from cheap ingredients, however inadequate those ingredients might be, was eagerly sought. Images of healthy, rosy-cheeked children in advertisements, often for products few could afford, stood in stark contrast to the reality for many families, serving as both an aspiration and a painful reminder of what was missing. There was a kind of cultural obsession with building strong bodies, even as the means to do so were evaporating. Historians still debate the full extent of the long-term cognitive and educational impacts of Depression-era childhood malnutrition. While it's notoriously difficult to isolate malnutrition from other poverty-related factors like stress, lack of educational resources and parental ill health, modern nutritional science tells us that early childhood malnutrition can have lasting effects on brain development, learning ability, and even behaviour. Were there children whose full intellectual potential was never realised because their brains were starved of essential nutrients during critical developmental windows? It's highly probable the lost generation wasn't just about lost economic opportunity. For some, it might have been about lost developmental potential too. You, as a child of the Depression, might carry these scars, visible or invisible. Perhaps you remember the constant feeling of not quite having enough to eat, the monotony of the food, the worry in your parents' eyes. You might recall the shame of having patched clothes or worn-out shoes. You might remember the specific taste of cod liver oil, or the longing for a piece of fresh fruit. These experiences shaped your relationship with food, with security, and with the world. The efforts to provide school lunches, often through programs supported by FERA or later the Works Progress Administration, WPA, were a direct response to the crisis of child malnutrition. For many children, the free or low-cost meal they received at school might have been the most nutritious, or even the only substantial meal of their day. These programs were lifelines, recognising that hungry children cannot learn effectively, and that society had a responsibility to protect its youngest and most vulnerable. So, when we talk about why food sucked in the Great Depression, it's crucial to remember that for children it wasn't just about unappetising meals or temporary hunger. It was about their very future, their physical and mental development being shaped by deprivation. The cheap, starchy, often nutrient-poor food that characterised the era left an indelible mark on a generation, a silent testament to the profound and lasting damage that widespread food insecurity can inflict, especially on the young. The hunger of a child echoes long after the stomach is finally filled. The gnawing hunger and struggle for food during the Great Depression weren't monolithic experiences. They manifested differently depending on where you lived. The challenges faced by a family in a crowded city tenement were distinct from those confronting a household in a remote rural area, even if the underlying cause, economic collapse, was the same. Food scarcity wore different masks in the urban jungle versus the countryside, each with its own particular brand of misery. Imagine you're in a bustling city like New York or Chicago. Your world is concrete and brick, not soil and fields. You're entirely dependent on a complex chain of commerce for every bite you eat. When that chain breaks down due to job losses and bank failures, your access to food is severed almost immediately. In the city, hunger was often a problem of access and affordability. Food might technically be available in stores, but if you had no money and no job, those grocery store shelves might as well be on the moon. Remember those breadlines and soup kitchens we talked about? Those were predominantly urban phenomena, responses to a concentrated population of hungry people with nowhere else to turn. In the city, you couldn't just go out to your backyard and pick a few vegetables if your pantry was bare. There was no garden, no cow for milk, no chickens for eggs. Your Hooverville, if you ended up in one, was likely built on a garbage dump, not fertile land. Scavenging, as we saw, became a grim urban art form. You relied on the leavings of others, on the strained resources of charitable organisations, or on meagre relief payments that barely covered rent, let alone an adequate diet. The anonymity of the city could be both a blessing and a curse. You might escape the close scrutiny of a small town, but you could also starve alone in a crowded tenement, your plight unnoticed. The sheer density of people meant that competition for scarce resources, a spot in the bread line, a handout from a charity, could be intense. Now shift your perspective to a rural area, perhaps a small farm in Appalachia, or a tenant farm in the Cotton Belt, or even a struggling homestead in a region not directly hit by the Dust Bowl's worst. Here, the problem wasn't always a complete lack of food in the immediate environment, but often a lack of cash and the means to preserve or supplement what you could grow. You might have a vegetable garden, a few chickens, maybe a pig. This could provide a baseline of sustenance that was unavailable to most city dwellers. You could, in theory, eat what you grew. However, rural poverty was often more isolating. If your crops failed due to drought, even outside the main Dust Bowl, or if the prices for what you did manage to grow were so low you couldn't afford seeds for the next planting, or tools, or medicine, or clothes, you were in deep trouble. There were fewer organised charities, fewer soup kitchens in sparsely populated areas. Relief efforts were often slower to reach remote communities. You were more reliant on your own immediate resources and the support of your equally struggling neighbours. A key historical fact is that rural electrification was very limited in the 1930s. This meant no refrigeration for most farm families, making food preservation, canning, drying, salting, smoking absolutely critical, but also laborious and dependent on having the necessary supplies: jars, sugar, salt, a working stove or smokehouse. A quirky difference often noted was the nature of begging or seeking aid. In the city, it might be standing in a breadline or directly asking strangers for spare change. In the country, it was often more subtle, a reliance on long-standing community ties. You might borrow a cup of flour from a neighbour, knowing you might not be able to repay it soon, or you'd share a bit of your hunt, if you were lucky enough to bag a squirrel or rabbit, with a family down the road you knew was struggling. There was a strong, though often strained culture of mutual aid in many rural communities, born of shared hardship and interdependence. However, if the entire community was destitute, this informal safety net could collapse. Historians still argue whether urban or rural populations suffered more acutely from hunger overall during the Depression. It's a complex comparison. City dwellers faced a more immediate and total cut-off from food sources if they lost their income, leading to the dramatic visibility of breadlines and soup kitchens. Rural dwellers might have had more direct access to some food, but often suffered from extreme cash poverty, isolation, and a lack of variety, leading to severe nutritional deficiencies like the pellagra epidemic in the south. They might not be starving in the sense of having absolutely nothing, but they could be slowly deteriorating from a diet of the 3 M's: meat, fatback, meal, cornmeal, and molasses, which was notoriously deficient. You in your rural setting might have a garden that produces beans and squash, but what about flour for bread, sugar for canning, coffee, shoes for your children? These all required cash, and cash was scarcer than hen's teeth. You might resort to barter, trading eggs for kerosene, or a few jars of canned vegetables for some mending from a neighbour who could sew. The general store, if it was still in business, might extend credit, but many storekeepers were also on the brink of ruin. The types of desperation dinners also varied. In the city, it might be hot dogs and macaroni. In the country, it might be a foraged meal of wild greens, poke salad, if you knew how to prepare it safely to remove toxins, and perhaps a little corn pone. Or it might be relying heavily on 1 or 2 staple crops you could grow, like sweet potatoes in some southern regions, eaten at every meal in every conceivable way. So, while the hunger was a shared national experience, its texture and the strategies for coping with it differed significantly between the city and the countryside. Urbanites battled for access in a world of commerce. Rural folks battled against the elements and isolation with what they could wring from the land in their own hands. Both faced the grim reality that the food available often sucked, either in quantity, quality, or the sheer grinding effort required to obtain and prepare it. The bright lights of the city couldn't hide the empty cupboards, and the green fields of the country couldn't always fill them. Amidst the widespread food scarcity, whether in the concrete expanses of the city or the struggling farmlands of the countryside, a small but vital source of sustenance began to sprout: relief gardens. These weren't the grand agricultural projects of the AAA. These were often small, community-based or individual efforts, encouraged and sometimes supported by local relief agencies or even businesses. They represented a tangible way for people to fight back against hunger, to cultivate a little bit of hope and a few fresh vegetables in a world that often seemed barren. Imagine a vacant lot in your city neighbourhood, previously an eyesore littered with trash and debris. Now, it's been cleared, divided into small plots, and people are hunched over, tending rows of beans, tomatoes, and squash. Or picture a corner of your own small backyard, if you were lucky enough to have one, now diligently turned over to grow potatoes and carrots instead of flowers. These were relief gardens, sometimes called thrift gardens or subsistence gardens. They were a practical response to the desperate need for fresh food, especially for families struggling to afford anything beyond the cheapest starches. The idea wasn't entirely new. Community gardens had existed before, but during the Depression, they took on a new urgency and scale. A key historical fact is that many municipalities, and even some large corporations, promoted and supported these gardening initiatives. Cities might provide access to unused public land, offer ploughing services, and sometimes distribute free seeds or tools. Companies like Ford and Firestone sponsored large, garden projects for their unemployed or underemployed workers, allowing them to cultivate plots to feed their families. It was seen as a way to supplement meagre relief payments, provide more nutritious food, boost morale, and keep idle hands occupied in a productive way. You might find yourself spending hours in one of these gardens. The work is hard, especially if you're unaccustomed to physical labour or weakened by a poor diet. You're digging in the soil, planting seeds, weeding, and anxiously watching for the first signs of growth. But there's a satisfaction in it too, a direct connection to the source of your food that was missing if your only option was the breadline. The taste of a fresh tomato or a crisp bean that you grew yourself after months of canned or starchy fare could feel like a revelation, a burst of flavour and nutrition that was almost forgotten. These gardens provided more than just calories. They provided crucial vitamins and minerals that were sorely lacking in many Depression-era diets. Fresh vegetables could help combat those hidden hunger pains, warding off deficiency diseases like scurvy or pellagra, at least to some extent. Even a small plot carefully tended could yield a surprising amount of produce during the growing season. It wouldn't make you rich, and it probably wouldn't provide all the food your family needed, but it could make a significant difference to your health and your food budget. A quirky aspect of some of these relief gardens was the sheer variety of things people tried to grow, sometimes with comical or frustrating results, depending on the soil, climate, and the gardener's skill, or lack thereof. You might see someone struggling to coax a watermelon vine to life on a tiny urban plot, or another diligently tending an exotic vegetable they'd only read about, hoping it would be a miracle crop. There was a lot of learning by doing, a lot of shared advice, some good, some not so good, passed between neighbouring gardeners. There was also, inevitably, the heartbreak of crops failing due to pests, disease, drought, or even theft, as desperation sometimes overrode community spirit. Historians still debate the overall quantitative impact of relief gardens on the national food supply. It's unlikely they produced enough to significantly alter the big picture of agricultural statistics. However, their qualitative impact on individual families and communities was often profound. Beyond the food itself, these gardens fostered a sense of self-reliance and community. People worked alongside each other, shared tips, celebrated successes, and commiserated over failures. They provided a small measure of control in a world where most people felt powerless. The psychological benefits, the sense of purpose, the connection to the earth, the ability to provide something fresh for your family, were arguably just as important as the vegetables themselves. You might be part of a community garden project organised by your local church or a relief committee, or you might be one of the many individuals who transformed their own small patch of ground. Even window boxes on tenement fire escapes were sometimes pressed into service to grow a few herbs or a tomato plant. Every little bit helped, and the knowledge gained. How to prepare soil, when to plant, how to deal with pests, were valuable skills that for some had been lost in the shift from rural to urban life. These gardens also played a role in food preservation, which we'll touch on more. If you had a good harvest from your relief garden, the next challenge was to make it last through the lean winter months. So, the beans would be canned, the tomatoes turned into sauce, the potatoes stored in a cool, dark place. The relief garden wasn't just about fresh summer eating, it was about planning for the future, a small act of faith that there would be a future to plan for. So, while the headlines might have focused on the dust storms or the AAA's grand policies, these small, unassuming gardens represented a quiet revolution of resilience. They were a grassroots response to hunger, a testament to the enduring human instinct to cultivate and nurture, even in the harshest of conditions. That small patch of green amidst the grey despair of the Depression, producing a few precious vegetables, was a powerful symbol that not all food had to suck. Sometimes, with a lot of hard work and a little bit of luck, you could coax something good from the earth, even if it was just a handful of beans or a single ripe tomato. It was a small victory, but in those times, small victories were everything. Those relief gardens, a small beacon of fresh hope, brought a new challenge once the harvest came in. How to make that precious bounty last. In an era before widespread home refrigeration, and with cash for store-bought preserved goods incredibly scarce, the age-old skills of food preservation, canning, drying, pickling and salting, became absolutely crucial. If you couldn't save the surplus from your garden, or a rare good buy at the market, it would quickly spoil. a tragic waste when every calorie was precious. Preserving the poultry wasn't just a thrifty habit, it was a vital survival strategy. Imagine your kitchen in late summer or early fall. If you've been fortunate with your relief garden, or perhaps managed to buy or barter for a bushel of apples or tomatoes when they were briefly cheap and plentiful, the room is a hive of activity. It's hot, steamy work. Large pots bubble on the stove filled with sterilising jars or simmering fruits and vegetables. The air is thick with the smell of vinegar if you're pickling, or sweet fruit if you're making jam or preserves, though sugar was a precious commodity, so often these were less sweet than modern versions. This wasn't a quaint hobby. This was a serious labour-intensive effort to stock your pantry against the coming winter, or the inevitable lean weeks ahead. Canning was king. Glass jars, often mason jars with their distinctive two-part lids, were treasured possessions. You'd carefully pack them with blanched vegetables, beans, peas, carrots, corn, or with fruits like peaches, pears or berries. Then came the crucial step of processing them in a boiling water bath, or, for low-acid foods like most vegetables and meats, if you were lucky enough to have meat to can, a pressure canner. Pressure canners were expensive and not everyone had one, which increased the risk of spoilage or worse, botulism, if low-acid foods weren't processed correctly. Botulism was a terrifying and often fatal form of food, poisoning, a constant worry for home canners. The instruction, boil for at least 10 minutes before tasting for home-canned vegetables, was a life-saving rule. A significant historical fact is the role of government agencies and home demonstration agents in promoting safe canning techniques. Organisations like the Bureau of Home Economics, part of the USDA, and cooperative extension services disseminated information through pamphlets, classes and demonstrations, teaching women, it was almost exclusively women's work, the proper methods for preserving food safely. This was vital public health work, helping to prevent illness and make the most of limited food resources. These agents would travel to rural communities, often setting up demonstrations in local schools or churches, showing women how to operate pressure canners and test jar seals. Drying was another ancient method that saw a major resurgence. Fruits like apples, peaches and plums could be sliced thinly and dried in the sun, if you lived in a suitable climate and could protect them from insects and dirt, or in a slow oven, if you could spare the fuel. Dried beans and peas were, of course, staples. Corn could be dried on the cob and later ground into cornmeal. Even some vegetables like string beans, leather breeches, could be threaded on strings and hung up to dry. Dried foods were lightweight, compact, and could last for a long time if stored properly, though they often required lengthy soaking and cooking to become palatable. Pickling, using vinegar and salt, was a common way to preserve cucumbers, beets, cabbage, for sauerkraut, and other vegetables. The sharp, tangy flavours of pickled foods could also help to liven up an otherwise bland diet of starches. Relishes and chutneys, often made with a mix of vegetables and sweetened with a little sugar or molasses, were another way to preserve the harvest and add zest to meals. You might have a row of colourful jars on your pantry shelf, green pickled beans, red beet pickles, golden corn relish, a testament to your summer's labour. A quirky, and perhaps less appetising aspect of Depression-era food preservation was the sheer determination to waste absolutely nothing. Watermelon rinds, which most people would discard today, were often pickled and eaten. Fruit pits were sometimes boiled to extract a little extra flavour for jelly. Even vegetable tops, like beet greens or turnip greens, which might have been ignored in more prosperous times, were carefully cooked and eaten or canned. If it was remotely edible, someone somewhere was trying to figure out how to preserve it. You might even hear of attempts to preserve things that seem utterly bizarre today, born of sheer desperation to not let anything go to waste. Historians still argue about the nutritional losses involved in these traditional preservation methods. Canning, especially the long boiling times used, can destroy some heat-sensitive vitamins like vitamin C and some B vitamins. Drying also results in some nutrient loss. However, preserved foods, even with some diminished nutritional value, were infinitely better than no food at all, especially during the winter months when fresh produce was unavailable or unaffordable. They provided calories, fibre and some remaining vitamins and minerals, helping to bridge the gap between harvests. The debate often centres on whether the emphasis on preservation, while necessary, sometimes overshadowed the need for a more consistently available supply of fresh-cost, nutrient-rich foods through better distribution and economic support. You, in your 1930s kitchen, become a master of these techniques. You learn to recognise the telltale pop of a successfully sealed canning jar with a sense of triumph. You know just how long to dry apples so they're leathery but not brittle. Your hands are stained from berries, chapped from endless washing of jars, and probably have a few nicks and burns from the hot stove and sharp knives. But the sight of your pantry shelves, slowly filling with jars of preserved food, brings a deep sense of security, however temporary. Each jar is a small victory against hunger, a tangible result of your hard work and foresight. This wasn't just about stocking up for winter, it was also about managing scarcity day to day. If you managed to get a small piece of meat, you might cook it all at once, then carefully preserve leftovers by potting them in fat or canning them in small quantities to make them last. Nothing was taken for granted. The food that sucked during the Depression often did so because it was monotonous or nutritionally poor, but the effort and skill that went into preserving what little there was ensured that there was something to eat, preventing an already bad situation from becoming utterly catastrophic for many families. Those rows of jars were more than just preserved food, they were preserved hope. Beyond the physical pangs of an empty stomach, the rotten taste of spoiled food, or the weariness of a body starved of nutrients, there was another, often unspoken dimension to why food sucked in the Great Depression. The constant, grinding psychological stress of food insecurity. The worry about where the next meal would come from, the shame of not being able to provide for your family, the anxiety of watching your children go hungry. These things took a profound toll on people's mental and emotional well-being. Food wasn't just a physical necessity. Its lack became a source of pervasive, corrosive anxiety. Imagine the mental state of a parent day in and day out, facing the question, what will we eat today? It's a heavy burden, a constant hum of worry that underlies every other thought and activity. You might lie awake at night, not from hunger itself, but from the anxiety of anticipating tomorrow's hunger. You scan newspapers, if you can get one, not for news of the world, but for advertisements of food sales, for any hint of a job, for any sign that things might get better. Every knock on the door could be the landlord demanding rent you can't pay, money that could have gone to food. The stress wasn't just about the lack of food, it was also about the quality of it. Serving your family the same monotonous, unappetizing meals day after day, that Hoover Stew again, or more potatoes and gravy, could be demoralizing for both the cook and the eaters. You longed to provide something better, something tasty and nourishing, but your resources were severely limited. There was a sense of failure, even if you knew intellectually that the economic conditions were beyond your control. The simple pleasure of eating, of enjoying a good meal, was replaced by the grim necessity of simply filling an empty space. A significant historical fact, though difficult to quantify precisely, is the observed increase in admissions to mental hospitals and reports of nervous breakdowns during the Depression years. While many factors contributed to this, unemployment, loss of status, hopelessness, the chronic stress related to basic survival needs like food and shelter undoubtedly played a major role. The constant struggle to make ends meet, the fear of eviction, the sight of your family's suffering, these were immense psychological pressures. Suicide rates also reportedly increased during the worst years of the Depression, a tragic indicator of the depths of despair some individuals reached. The shame associated with poverty and needing help was a powerful psychological stressor. Remember those breadlines and soup kitchens. For many, accepting charity was a deeply humiliating experience, a public admission of defeat. People who had always been self-reliant and proud found themselves in situations that stripped them of their dignity. This could lead to feelings of worthlessness, depression, and social withdrawal. You might avoid seeing old friends or participating in community activities because you felt ashamed of your circumstances, of your worn-out clothes, or your inability to reciprocate hospitality. A quirky, yet telling manifestation of this psychological stress was the emergence of certain fad diets, or health crazes, even amid scarcity. Sometimes these were desperate attempts to find a cheap miracle food that would solve all nutritional problems. Other times they might reflect a kind of anxiety-driven obsession with controlling the one thing you felt you could control, what you put into your body, however limited the choices. You might hear of people rigorously adhering to strange dietary rules, gleaned from a dubious pamphlet or a charismatic but unqualified health guru, perhaps as a way to impose some order on a chaotic and frightening world. It's a bit like trying to meticulously arrange the deck chairs on the Titanic, a futile attempt to control the uncontrollable. Historians still debate the long-term psychological scarring effects of growing up or living through the Great Depression. Many from that generation carried a deep-seated fear of poverty and insecurity throughout their lives, even if they later achieved financial stability. This could manifest as extreme frugality, like those habits of saving string we mentioned earlier, a reluctance to trust institutions, or a persistent anxiety about the future. The constant worry about food experienced in formative years could leave an indelible mark on one's outlook and behaviour. Was the greatest generation also, in some ways, the most anxious generation when it came to basic security? You, living through this, feel this stress in your bones. It's in the tightness in your chest when you look at your nearly empty pantry. It's in the irritability that sometimes flares up over small things, because your nerves are constantly frayed. It's in the forced cheerfulness you try to adopt for your children, even when your heart is heavy. You might find yourself obsessing about food, thinking about it constantly, dreaming about it, meticulously planning how to stretch what little you have. The mental energy consumed by this constant worry is enormous, diverting focus from other aspects of life. The lack of variety and pleasure in food also contributed to a kind of sensory deprivation. Food is meant to be enjoyed, to be a source of comfort and celebration. When it becomes purely utilitarian, a mere means of staving off hunger, something important is lost from the human experience. The drab, monotonous meals reflected the drabness and uncertainty of life itself. So, when we consider why food sucked in the Great Depression, it's crucial to look beyond the plate. The psychological burden of food insecurity, the anxiety, the shame, the constant worry, was a heavy, invisible weight that millions carried every day. It flavoured every meagre meal with bitterness and uncertainty. It wasn't just your stomach that was empty. It was often your spirit too, worn down by the relentless day-to-day struggle to simply find enough to eat. The mind, just like the body, was starved. The Great Depression, with its years of food scarcity, desperation dinners, and hidden hunger, didn't just fade away without leaving a trace. Like a deep wound, it left scars on the American psyche and fundamentally altered the nation's relationship with food, waste, and security. The echoes of that hardship resonated for decades, shaping government policy, consumer behaviour, and the very way people thought about their next meal. The food of the Depression might have sucked, but the experience ensured that future generations would strive to never let it suck quite so badly again. Imagine the war years of the 1940s, and then the post-war boom. Factories are humming again, jobs are plentiful, and for many, prosperity returns. Supermarkets, a relatively new concept before the Depression, begin to proliferate, their shelves groaning with an unprecedented abundance and variety of food. Refrigerators become commonplace in American homes. Yet, for those who lived through the 1930s, the memory of empty cupboards and breadlines often lingers. This generation, forged in scarcity, frequently carried a deep-seated aversion to waste that their children, raised in abundance, might find baffling or even amusing. You, if you were a child or young adult during the Depression, might find yourself meticulously saving leftovers, even tiny amounts. You might instinctively buy food in bulk when it's on sale, not out of hoarding, but from a lingering fear that it might not be there tomorrow, or that you might not be able to afford it. The phrase "waste not, want not" isn't just a quaint saying, it's a deeply ingrained principle. You might finish every scrap on your plate and insist your children do the same, perhaps invoking the classic parental guilt trip. Think of the starving children, a phrase that had a very real, very personal resonance for you. Those habits of extreme frugality, learned in the crucible of the Depression, often became lifelong traits. One of the most significant and lasting impacts of the Great Depression on food was the expansion of government involvement in food security and agricultural policy. The New Deal, programs like the AAA and the distribution of surplus commodities, established a precedent for federal intervention that continued and evolved. A major historical fact is the establishment of the first federal food stamp program in 1939, initially designed to help needy families purchase surplus agricultural products. Though it was later discontinued and then revived in the 1960s, its origins lie directly in the experiences of the Depression. a recognition that the market alone could not always ensure that everyone had enough to eat. Similarly, national school lunch programs, which also had roots in Depression-era relief efforts, became a permanent fixture, aimed at ensuring a baseline of nutrition for children. The Depression also spurred significant advancements in food processing, preservation, and fortification. The need for cheap, shelf-stable and nutritious, or at least nutrient-enhanced foods drove innovation. The enrichment of bread and flour with vitamins and minerals, like niacin to combat pellagra and iron to combat anemia, became standard practice, partly as a public health response to the widespread deficiencies seen during the 1930s. The canning industry boomed, and new methods of food preservation, like freezing, though widespread home freezers came later, gained traction. The goal was to create a food supply that was more resilient, more easily distributed, and less susceptible to the kind of catastrophic failures seen in the Depression. A quirky, and perhaps ironic legacy of Depression-era eating habits can be seen in the persistence of certain comfort foods that have their origins in scarcity. Dishes like macaroni and cheese, meatloaf, or even S.O.S, creamed chipped beef on toast, which were once staples of make-do cuisine, have achieved a kind of nostalgic, iconic status for some. They represent a culinary link to the past, a reminder of resourcefulness and resilience, even if their original context was one of hardship. Of course, today's versions are often much richer and more elaborate than their Depression-era counterparts. You wouldn't find artisanal truffle mac and cheese in a Hooverville, that's for sure. Historians still debate the extent to which the Depression permanently changed American attitudes towards social welfare and the role of government. Did it create a lasting consensus for a robust social safety net, or are those lessons periodically forgotten and relitigated? The ongoing debates about food assistance programs, agricultural subsidies, and poverty reduction suggest that the legacy is complex and contested. However, it's undeniable that the Great Depression forced a national reckoning with the problem of hunger and the government's responsibility to address it. The idea that citizens have a right to food, at least in a developed nation, gained much wider acceptance. For you, looking back from a more prosperous future, the food of the Depression might seem like a distant nightmare. But the taste of it, the feel of that constant gnawing hunger, or the anxiety of not knowing how you'd feed your children, never entirely leaves you. It informs your choices, your values, your anxieties. You might marvel at the casual way younger generations discard food, or their expectation of instant gratification when it comes to meals. You remember when an orange was a rare Christmas treat, or when a single egg was carefully divided. The lessons of the Depression kitchen, resourcefulness, planning, avoiding waste, and the importance of community sharing, became part of the cultural DNA for many who lived through it. The food absolutely sucked for a multitude of reasons. It was scarce, monotonous, often nutritionally deficient, and a source of immense psychological stress. But the very awfulness of that experience fueled a determination, both individual and collective, to build a future where such widespread hunger would not be tolerated, where the promise of plenty would be more equitably shared. The echoes of those hard times remind us that food is more than just sustenance. It's about dignity, security, and the health of a nation. And now, as our exploration of this challenging time draws to a close, the clatter of those soup kitchen spoons begins to fade, the ghostly images of breadlines recede, and the gritty taste of Dust Bowl despair thankfully lessens its hold on our imaginations. We've walked through the stark kitchens and barren fields of the 1930s, and seen how profoundly the simple act of finding enough to eat shaped an entire generation, how it underscored the fragility of prosperity and the resilience of the human spirit when faced with dire want. The memory of that hardship, the collective scar tissue, served as a powerful impetus for change, reminding subsequent generations of the crucial importance of a secure and adequate food supply for all. It is a testament to those who endured, who stretched every scrap, who planted those small relief gardens with hopeful hands, that the nation slowly, painstakingly rebuilt its tables and its trust. May we always remember the taste of their struggle, not to dwell in bitterness, but to appreciate the bounty, however modest, that graces our own lives today, and to remain vigilant against the spectre of such widespread want ever returning. The lights are dimming further now, the stories quieting, a gentle peace settling in.